Hi there guys, in this tutorial I'm going to be showing you how to create a 64 square kilometer terrain in Unreal Engine. I'm going to be using the Brushify Grasslands pack as a basis to build out the level. So, to start off, I'm going to go to Launch, and I'm going to launch Unreal Engine 4. And it'll come up with a screen here that lets me create a new project. So if I click on New Project, I can choose from the various game genres. I can use any of these as a base. So if you want to build a driving game, choose the driving game genre. Or if you want to create a third-person game, choose the third-person template. That's what I'm going to choose. I'm going to turn off the starter content because I don't want any of these extra assets from Epic. I'm just going to call this project 64 kilometers test. And then I'm just going to click Create Project. So when you first load up the project, you're going to get something like this. It's the third-person test map. So there is one thing that I need to do to start using the Brushify Grasslands pack, and that is to disable static lighting. So you simply need to go up to Edit and then Project Settings, and scroll down on the list and hit Rendering. And you'll find the setting for static lighting in the lighting section. You can alternatively just search at the top for static, and it should come up as well. So yeah, just untick that and then restart the editor. Once I've done that, I can now go to the marketplace. So I have a couple of products that are out right now. One is the Mountains pack and the other is the Grasslands pack. I'm also going to be adding more packs in the future. For this tutorial, I'm going to be using the Grasslands pack. So here, I'm just going up to the marketplace and you can find the Grasslands pack under Environments. So you can either search for Brushify and all the packs should appear, or if you just go to the Environments tab and scroll down a bit, you'll probably see one of the Brushify packs there. So here I'm just clicking Add to Project, and I'm choosing 64 kilometers test, and then Add to Project. So now I just have to wait a second while Unreal adds those files to my project, and it's got to sort of verify everything. So now that's done, all I need to do is just click on 64 kilometers test and open that up. And again, we see the third person level. But if I go up to File, Open Level, you can then go to the Brushify folder and choose Maps, Grasslands, and open up the Grasslands map. And there's not that much in the level, so it loads pretty fast. And this is how it looks when you first install the pack. So yeah, it's quite a generic Grasslands environment. I did include a few rocks just to showcase how you can use the procedural systems in Unreal Engine to scatter some geometry automatically on the terrain. I'll probably do a dedicated video on that in the future, just showing how the procedural systems work and how you can effectively use those in game development. So I'm just going to zoom out here and sort of show you an overview of the entire map. So you can see that the way it works is there is a very small playable section of terrain in the middle right now, and there's a sort of surrounding of static meshes which make up the background. And these are sort of brushes that you can just sort of move around and use to sort of shape the distance terrain. So for now I'm just going to delete all of the background meshes, and I'm going to also delete the 1 kilometer squared terrain that we have there. So there's basically nothing in the level right now apart from the lighting that was already nicely set up in that scene before. So now I'm going to create a new landscape and drag and drop that into the scene. And the first thing that I'm going to do is make sure that I reset the location of the landscape so that the origin is in the very center of the level. This is a very good practice because in 3D, animations and other movement gets more accurate the closer it is to the origin. Now, I'm going to make the terrain even bigger by increasing the section size to 255 by 255 quads. I'm also going to set the sections per component to 2 by 2. Then I'm just going to max out the number of components. In this case, it's 16 by 16. That will give us a map that's roughly 8 times the size of what we had before, so 8 by 8 kilometers as opposed to what we had before, which was just 1 by 1 kilometers. And you can see that the overall resolution of our terrain is now 8K by 8K. So the great thing about this is that it has the exact same resolution as that 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer terrain. Now the other thing that's quite important here is to make note of the number of components. The more components you have, the more intensive it's going to be on the processing side. Landscapes are divided into multiple components, which are Unreal's base unit for rendering, visibility calculation, and collision. So ideally, for the best possible accuracy, you would need more components. However, less components will perform a lot better on the CPU side. It's up to the individual developer to decide whether or not he needs that extra accuracy. If you would like the extra accuracy, simply go to sections per component and change that to 1 by 1, and then increase the number of components. Now you can see that the number of components is 1024 as opposed to 256, which is what we had before. For now, I'm going to keep mine set to 256 components, just because I don't really need the accuracy and I prefer to have the speed. So once you're done with setting up these parameters, simply hit Create, and Unreal will create this new terrain. And just be sure to double check that everything's still centered to the origin. So now I'm just going to zoom in here. I've got a few rocks that I'm just going to re-simulate so that it deletes those. Okay, and those are gone. So you'll notice that I've got a pretty much blank map and the terrain is completely grey. So I'm going to want to texture that terrain. So to do that, I'm going to use one of the landscape materials that come with Brushify. In the content browser, if I go to Brushify, and then Materials, and then Landscape, you can see all the various landscape material instances. And I'm just going to drag the Grasslands material onto the landscape material slot. And now you'll see that the landscape now has this Grasslands texture applied. This material is an auto material, which means as I sculpt on the terrain, all the slopes are going to be automatically textured with rock face textures. So of course here I've got a completely blank terrain, so now we're just going to start trying to fill that with some more details. So I'm going to start quickly sculpting a new environment on this terrain now. So if you go to the Modes panel and choose Landscape, then go to the Sculpting tool and change where it says Circle to Alpha. Then select the Brushify texture from the texture slot. And as I switch between the texture channels, you can see how the various textures switch out. These are all the different brushes contained within that single texture. So the one I'm going to use is this erosion brush right here. And I'm going to set the brush size a little bit higher. And as you can see, as I move the brush around the terrain, it's sort of rotating in the direction of my mouse cursor. So to disable that, just untick Auto Rotate. You can now manually change the rotation using the Texture Rotation slider. So I'm just going to move the content browser a little bit out of the way so you can see a little better. So if I click on the terrain now, you can see that not very much happens when I click. And that's because the tool strength isn't high enough. So I'm going to change the tool strength to 4. And the other thing that's very important that I'm going to do is turn on Use Clay Brush. Using the clay brush will give you dramatically different results when sculpting on the terrain with an alpha brush. It really helps to bring out all the little details in the texture, and it's generally a much better sculpting mode. Try turning the modes on and off yourself and you'll see the sort of difference that it makes. So now I'm going to position the brush over the terrain and click. So pretty much instantly, I get some really nice erosion effects, and as you can see, the terrain material has automatically textured the terrain. So there's all kind of rocks on the slope, and there's a lot of detail going on there. So I'm just going to quickly build a small valley out of these, and you can watch my progress. So I'm just sort of clicking around, switching between different brushes, and piecing together a valley here. So the really great thing about this process is that I can do everything in Unreal Engine and I don't need to go to another external program. This is really a big game changer for level design because it means that you can iterate extremely quickly on levels without having to go back and forth. So now I'm just going to start on the other side of the valley and put another stamp there. And we already have a pretty cool looking valley going already. And don't be afraid to reuse the same brushes over and over. Generally, if you rotate them and rescale them, nobody's going to really notice that you're using the same thing over and over again. The terrain also acts as a sort of basis for all of the other things that are going to go on top of that in the end, like assets such as trees and rocks. At the moment, the grass is actually missing on the terrain, so in order to get that to show up, make sure you go to the landscape panel and go to the paint section, and then in layers, make sure you set the correct layer info file. In the future, I'm going to make a video dedicated to paint layers and how you can add your own custom paint layers to the material shader. So that's going to be really useful if you want to add your own things like, dirt, fields, roads, those sort of extras to the terrain. So here I'm just going to jump into the game and start running around. And you can already see I've got a pretty convincing landscape going here. And that's not really taken too long, maybe just 5-10 minutes work. So one of the things that sort of sticks out to me here is that there are some quite hard lines and edges in the terrain. So you have two options to fix this. One would be to make a smaller terrain with more high resolution detail, or the other option is to smooth out the terrain. So I'm going to jump out of the game here and I'm going to go to the landscape panel. Then I'm going to go to the smooth tool. So my brush size is already very big, but if yours isn't, just make sure you make it larger to cover the whole terrain. And you can see that there's a parameter here called filter kernel radius. This is a really useful parameter because it lets you smooth out large details while preserving the smaller details. So I'm just going to quickly try and find a setting here that works well for this situation. This is a bit of trial and error, and you just have to keep clicking and then changing the setting and then going back and forth until you can see it's doing what you want. So in this case, I keep clicking and it's, removing way too many details. Once you get it to a point where it's only smoothing out the terrain very slightly in the way that you want, just make a few small clicks and it should smooth out the terrain quite well. This is a bit of a sort of sledgehammer approach, and usually if you're working on smaller environments or a smaller area, you could spend more time detailing it and sort of making sure that you don't over smooth some elements of the terrain that have cool details. So now I'm just going to jump back in game and see how it looks. So now the terrain's pretty smooth, there's less jagginess on the slope there. Just going to have a quick run around the rest of the valley and see how that is. So we can also compare, if we lost any details between the smooth and, sort of before and after. And I don't think that we lost that many details actually. So it should be okay. Generally, you want the terrain that the player is running across to be quite smooth anyway. If you're going to have things like people running along the terrain or, perhaps vehicles, you're always going to want the terrain to be slightly smoother, just so the player doesn't get caught up on any hard edges. That's just really sort of from a pure gameplay perspective, a lot better. You can have a lot more details in the distance. So one of the other things that's built into the Brushify Grasslands pack is a procedural foliage spawner for rocks. This is already set up for you, so if you click on the procedural foliage volume right there in the viewport, or just zoom out and you'll see a big box that covered the entire original 1 km² level. So this procedural foliage volume is basically an area where all of these procedural rocks are going to be spawning. And you can adjust the brush size settings to make that box bigger or smaller. And that just pretty much alters the size of the box. So I'm just going to place it over the area that we just dressed up. If you'd like to generate it for the entire map, just make the box the whole size of the map. So the great thing about this setup is that there's not really a limitation in the amount of volumes you can have. The only real performance drawback or limitation is in the assets themselves that are spawned by this procedural foliage spawner. So yeah, make sure that you have the procedural foliage spawner selected and just scroll down and go to simulate, resimulate. And I'm just going to hit that and it will start placing the foliage. It takes a couple of seconds, but once it's done, you should find that it's placed rocks all over the terrain. The cool thing about this is that they have a certain rule set, which means they only spawn on certain slopes and edges. So all of that is already set up for you in the Brushify Grasslands pack. However, if you take a look at that setup, you should be able to switch the assets out for your own. So I'm just going to go into the procedural foliage spawner, and you can see that there is a file in the content browser. Just click the little magnifying glass icon in the procedural foliage spawner. It will take you to the file, and that will in turn lead you to the foliage spawner list. So this file is pretty much a list of all of the foliage types that will spawn with the spawner. Each of those foliage types contain certain settings that control how they are spawned. So you can see all of the different foliage types in the list, and right now I just have sort of large, medium, and small rocks in the list. So if you do have assets that you want to sort of swap these out for, maybe you've bought those assets or you've created some yourself, this is the area that you want to swap those out. You'll need to make sure that you make foliage types for each of those, and that those foliage types contain all the correct settings for procedural distribution. So these foliage types that are defined here are pretty much the exact same ones that you would sort of drag and drop into the foliage panel in order to sort of paint those manually. So really, it's exactly the same setup. And if we open up one of the foliage types themselves, and a handy little feature here is that you can actually select multiple foliage types and you'll right click and then bulk edit them all at once. That's really useful if you want to edit a lot of assets at the same time. Now you'll notice that there aren't actually any settings by default that are related to the procedural systems. This is because by default, Unreal Engine doesn't have procedural spawning enabled. So this is a setting that you need to manually enable in the Unreal Engine editor preferences. So to get those settings to show, you need to go up to Edit, Editor Preferences, and then just type Procedural. And then you want to tick Procedural Foliage and the experimental features. So once you've added that setting in, just exit and restart the editor. Make sure that you save the current level and all your progress. Okay, so I've just done a restart, and I'm just going to load up my level again. And you can see now that if I load up the foliage type, I've got a new settings panel called Procedural. This will let me change all the sort of various settings related to how these rocks are distributed on the terrain. I'm not going to go into details about what each setting does right now, but I might do that in a future video. It's pretty much possible to learn this setup for a lot of sort of trial and error and just adjusting different values. It's a really powerful system that lets you sort of, cluster plants together, trees, grow and spawn things on, different slopes, angles, and that kind of stuff. So it's a really powerful tool which I highly recommend you guys look into. I pretty much learnt the tool by, changing the settings around and then hitting resimulate and, changing some more settings, going resimulate until I got sort of, good results. And once the settings are all saved, you're pretty much good to go. So now we've got that set up, I'm just going to hit play, and I'm just going to start running around the level a little bit and see what we've got. So the big thing that's missing here is that we don't really have any background mountains. Brushify comes with distant background mountain meshes that are built for exactly this purpose. These are sort of meshes that can be used to extend the horizon. And this should really help us to avoid that typical game look where you have fog that kind of masks out the entire background, or worse, just a flat line. So I'm going to jump back out of the game, and I'm going to go to the content browser. I'm going to choose Brushify, and go to the distance meshes folder, and I'm just going to start dragging in the sort of various distance meshes. So this one's called Generic Erosion 01. Now the cool thing about these meshes is that they're textured to match the landscape material. So you can see that the sort of textures are kind of similar in their consistency and color. You can't really get too close to these, but they are 8K resolution textures, so they do hold up pretty well. But they're really more for the distance. So I'm just going to push this mesh right back into the very distance, and I'm going to increase the scale up a little bit there. And you can really get quite far by just sort of translating and rotating and using the scale to get some different shapes and patterns of the horizon. So here I'm just bringing in one of the bigger snow mountains. You actually get one of these with the pack. And I'm just going to drag on the material instance for Grasslands. and now it's sort of got grass on the base of it, but a bit of a snow top. And yeah, same thing again, just push it all the way back into the horizon, increase the scale, and just use the sort of rotate, translate, to see what kind of results you can get. And this sort of makes the process of building huge, background, backdrops and big landscapes just a little bit easier. I can spend so much time just playing around with these, these mountains, trying to get, interesting looking vistas. And that's really how it boils down. It's a lot of sort of reusing the same assets, but, different ways, and seeing what you can do. If something doesn't look good, just move it around. It's a bit of trial and error there, but generally you can get some really nice results. So this is where the sort of, technology part fades away and it becomes more of an artistic challenge. It's really great because it's, it's much quicker than, some medium like painting, because everything's there for you. It's already textured and it's already lit. You have to worry about, how's the lighting, how's the shading or something. So if you're a concept artist, this could also be very useful just to have something like this for your backdrops. Maybe you want to overpaint them afterwards, or do something like that. But just a very quick way to get good results. So zooming out here, you can see that I've sort of put some of these meshes in the middle of the map. But usually, if I want to build an actual 64 square kilometers terrain, I want to sort of move these all the way to the sort of outer edge. And this means that, you've got that full sort of 64 square kilometers for the player to run around in. Of course, that does mean that they're much, much further away in the distance, so we might have to scale them up. And I'm just going to also adjust the fog a little bit to make that a little bit easier to see them. So you can just go into the exponential height fog, and the setting that you want to change is the fog density, and just sort of lower that down a little bit. And that way you'll get sort of a nicer gradient. And these are so far away now that I really need to sort of scale these up. So I'm just going to go into the scale and sort of lock that off. And yeah, so that's sort of like, 100 scale. And we can go even higher than that. Don't be afraid to push the scale really high. There's not really a huge limitation there. And once you do that, you can just, start placing them back down again. Usually takes a little bit of eyeballing to get it right. Another thing that can, really help is to use reference with it for this kind of stuff. Take a look on Google Images, try and find a sort of mountain range that you really like, and make sure that you're in the, sort of the right ballpark in terms of the scale and size of it. Try not to push the mountains so that they're ridiculously sized. What is great with the Brushify stuff is that it's, out of the box, it's already a real mountain, with the correct height setup and everything. So you might notice that there's a bit of a sort of seam where the terrain meets the sort of mesh, distance mesh mountains. So I'm just going to go back into the sculpting tool and just kind of sculpt around a little bit one of the meshes here to kind of blend them together. Because yeah, you really don't want players to see any sort of like cut off at the edge of the map or anything like that, where the terrain doesn't really blend in. So here I always forget to turn the strength up, but yeah, just turn the strength up to like 4. And then click, make sure the clay mode is on, and then yeah, you should get pretty good results right there on the terrain. And just sort of go around the edge of the mesh. And you'd also want to make sure you kind of block that area off with, things that stop people from actually being able to walk over there, like maybe high cliffs or rocks, that kind of stuff. Because ideally, it would be even better if this whole area, if you wouldn't have this big sort of distance mesh there, but instead you try and build that mountain out of actual, playable terrain. So if I go back to the old vantage point that we had before, let's see how that looks. So yeah, still a lot of work we can do there. But yeah, I'm just going to jump in game again and sort of admire my handiwork, see what it looks like. So you can really see the speed at which, this sort of comes together. I'm iterating very, very quickly and building this massive level. And, it's really just a matter of sort of putting more time into it now. But definitely these sort of tools make it easy to make changes and add new areas. So I've just noticed, I can improve some of the mountains here. I'm just going to sort of move those around a little bit and see if I can get those looking a bit nicer, fading better into the distance, into the fog. So in this case, I'm really thinking about sort of aerial perspective, how the sort of atmosphere fades into the fog and just kind of layering the landscape up. This is something that works really well for, achieving that big distance look and using the fog to its full effect. What's also really useful is to make sure that you have some sort of height fog, which means that the sort of fog around the base of the mountain that's kind of blending away, and this gives it a bit more altitude. What's great is that Unreal comes with both atmospheric fog and exponential height fog, which you can sort of use in combination. So here I'm just adjusting the exponential height fog a little bit to sort of bring it out a little bit higher, make it look a bit like the mountains are bigger and further in the distance. And really just never be afraid of scale, because honestly these mountains can be just absolutely huge. So the bigger, the more epic, the better, I think. And of course, if you're sort of worried about the player, getting too close to these meshes, just make sure you move them back right to the edge of the map. And you can also use a lot of different tricks to, again, blend them in to the real terrain. Because of course you don't want the player to get too close to these, otherwise it will look quite ugly. You can also just use other sort of more detailed landscape meshes, that are sort of smaller scale, to kind of supplement the base of these, and those will look a little bit better on the bases. So here I'm just kind of duplicating the same one and moving that around to kind of cover up the stuff that's a bit closer to us. And then of course you can then taper that into the terrain again, using the terrain brushes to make sure the terrain has some detail around the base of the mountain there. And then it's sort of up to you, how you block off the player again. You can use cliffs, you can use water, you can use invisible walls, whatever you think is really necessary for your game. I personally prefer to sort of use natural barriers in most cases, unless it's just a massive amount of work to sort of tear down that barrier and then expand the map or something like that. But generally games like Crysis were really cool where you'd reach the edge of the map and there would just be no way to progress because there's a natural barrier there. I love that way of, that realistic way of containing the player in the game. So yeah, I'm not going to spend too much longer on this map. I think you guys get the idea of, the kind of things that you need to do in order to build a map of this size. It's really just a case of, developing the distance meshes in all the different various directions. I've shown you guys how to use the landscape material, how to use some of the procedural tools in Unreal Engine. Here I'm just going to put the kind of icing on the cake, last minute adjustments to the fog and everything. And if I take a look at the frame rate here, right now I actually have a really high-end PC, but I actually built the Brushify packs on quite a low-end system. It was just an HD 7970 graphics card from I think like 7 years ago or something, and it was running perfectly well there. So I tried to keep this terrain landscape material as cheap as possible. There's nothing too expensive there. There's not lots and lots of layers on top of each other. So generally it should run pretty well on sort of mid-range cards from maybe 3 or 4 years ago. This also makes it really sort of ideal for VR as well, as a kind of basis for a very light environment for that. So yeah, pretty much that's how I would approach a 64 square kilometer map in Unreal Engine. Hopefully I'm going to have even more tutorials for you guys soon, and I'm going to be developing my workflows and my tools to try and make it even easier to do maps in Unreal. I'll leave the details on the pack and the assets in the description below, and I really hope you guys found this video useful. Cheers!